that most of you are here, I guess, is because you want to hear something about pension schemes. Jane has been in the news because she has been engaged in a one-woman campaign to try to protect our pensions from her directorship at USS. In a very timely manner, the executive report on Jane that was compiled by, I think, no less than 5 teams of solicitors was leaked yesterday, and you can find it online. It's interesting to see a report that is ostensibly there for the purposes of justifying Jane's suspension, which reads quite so much like a hagiography. I just wanted to read one part of it for you. I guess this is now in the public domain. So, Professor Hutton held a belief that she was appointed to the board in effect to act as a statistician, which led her to take on a quasi-advisory or executive role and apply herself meticulously to USS's affairs. Most illustrative of this is her very detailed approach to the 2017 valuation, including her continued requests for information which we consider were disproportionate in the circumstances. So somehow part of her crime here is that she's been too meticulous, she's been too detailed, and in her request for information. So, I mean, I will leave you to make of that what you wish. But I will now hand over to Jane to talk about pensions and pension schemes. Thank you, Jane. I need to keep it quite close.
So, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the pub for hosting me. I haven't done a pint of science talk first, so I guess this is my pint of science talk. What I'm going to do is, you'll appreciate I'm not going to comment on, I have no idea how a confidential document got out. I see it was, there was a document from Alistair Jarvis before that. I have no idea how it got there. I am not responsible, and I am not going to make any comments on the executive summary. What I'm going to do in this, I will mention USS a couple of times for public domain information. One of the things I want to do actually is to talk a bit about pensions, somewhat more generally, some of what the issues are. I've been talking to a young colleague, Tom King, about data ethics. I think a lot of this is about statistics, data ethics in general. I think it's probably influenced British Steel, British Home Stores. That's why Saul Jackler and I organised a meeting at the Royal Society. There are important issues to which academics can and should contribute by saying, can we please make an effort to get the quality of information and the quality of arguments of the highest standards that is feasible. So, thank you. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about core aspects of DB and DC, in other words, defined benefit or defined contribution, because that, of course, is part of the discussion and the dispute. And I'm going to talk about some aspects of the valuation. What benefits are promised, or what is promised, what's it going to cost, because that's actually what this is all about. And then I'm going to do examples, and I hope you'll forgive me, but a lot of them are really deliberately toy examples. So much of the time I ignore inflation or anything like that, right? I'm just going for what are the sorts of issues that come up that we need to think about. So what do you need to do when you need to decide how much money to put away, the pension valuation? You need to think about, well, how long are people going to live? When are they going to retire? What are we going to do about early retirement or ill health retirement? What about family structures? I think my grandmother died, my grandfather died slightly too early for my grandmother to get a pension from what he did. So the idea that you might have widows, widowers, pensions. I've got a friend whose husband sadly died. Daughter's got ME, so she gets a dependence pension as a child. What are we going to do about that? Is that a good idea? What about death in service? What about transfers in and out, people withdrawing? The great thing about USS is, I suspect many of you, you can move around the UK and you don't need to keep changing your pension scheme. That's actually really useful. Now, how do you want your salary to relate to your pensions? Well, there's data on this, particularly in the large schemes like BT, USS, Railways pensions, and there are statistical methods you could use. Next. Then, of course, you've got the economic side of these. You know, if you're going to save money, so this is where I briefly acknowledge things like pensions. What do you do with inflation? When I first started working, I think the interest rate on my mortgage was 14% and it went up to 16%. Rather different now, shall we say. Where are you going to invest the money? I've got a report by the World Bank on what's happened in Canada. Canada has done a lot of very good work on their public pensions. And they had, pre-reform, it was just the money was invested in government and doing very little. But, well, you might want to play in equities and hedge funds and so on, but there are other things you can do, like property. So one of the Swiss pension funds has built a large amount of social housing. So it's not just investing, it's providing. Now USS 2-3 years back has done something like that as well. One of their investments is in housing for people who need slightly sheltered accommodation. So I rather like the idea that part of my pension savings are being used constructively for infrastructure, for perhaps development in developing countries, infrastructure, so that you can actually move things around and so on. But again, statistics has been doing forecasting for quite a long time. There are methods you can use, and some of us are rather inclined to think you should use them. Okay, so pension. Let's do the really simple version. Yeah. We've got a salary. How are we going to relate it to the pension? So, defined benefit. There are two main versions. The clue is in the word defined benefit. You know what you're going to get in relation to your salary. And the two main versions are final salary. You get your final salary and a fraction according to how many years you've worked out of something. Career average still says you will get a proportion of your salary, but it depends on, say, for every year you work, you get a proportion of that year, and as your salary changes, the proportion changes. Or, of course, you can have a defined contribution, which is you will put 10% of your salary into a pot compulsorily, and you'll get it all back at the end. So, defined contribution. You might also have collective defined contribution, because defined contribution is, as I'll show later, you're on your own. Go out into the commercial markets. The Royal Mail has got a collective defined contribution. It actually looks remarkably like what USS was in 1974, before various pension acts. And as it implies, you're trying to get back the benefits of averaging. Insurance is essentially all about pooling your risks, so that on average, some of you will pay in a bit more than you get out, some of you will get out more than you put in, but it's mutually beneficial. So let's go and talk a little bit more about these things. The basic idea of a pension is you're an adult, you're going to work from age 20 to 60 and you're going to earn $30,000 a year, and then you're going to live for 20 years after you retire. So you could take all the money, spend it every year, and then have nothing to live on. Okay, clearly if you're actually living a subsistence life, that's far too near to reality to be nice, and you're dependent on your children. On the other hand, what you could do is what we're showing on the next slide, which is to say I'm going to top slice while I'm earning and chuck it in there when I finish. And by the way, that is where you get the typical 1/80ths. Working for 40 years, saving an 80th every year. If you did 40 years, 40 out of 80, we get a half. And if you live half as long after retirement as you worked before, then you would be doing this kind of balance. Okay? That's the basic idea behind the defined, final salary defined benefit. Of course, life isn't that simple because we get different salary paths. So, next. But let's think of that to start with. What a defined benefit plan is, when you retire on that scheme, you had 30,000, you kept 20,000 a year while you were working, and when you retired, you knew you'd still have 20,000. So you knew how much you would get. With a defined contribution, what you're going to do, if there were no inflation, is we've saved 10,000 a year for 40 years, here is £40,000. Off you go. Bye. Okay, next. So typically the final salary is going to depend on years of service, and there'll be some kind of highest salary over some number of years, 3, 5 or 10 years. The career average revalued, like inflation system, basically says what you're going to get, again, depends on your years of service, but it's going to depend on the salary every year, not just your final salary, the final few years. Defined contribution is simply, we're building up a pot of money, and you're going to have to take that pot of money. Okay, so let's look at the toy examples again. And, well, does it matter when you're valuing a pension fund what the salary path looks like? When I started, the salary path looked pretty much like that black. It was fairly typical that you would be a junior lecturer. Okay, lots of you are too junior to have ever heard of junior lecturers. And then you might be a lecturer. You might get promoted to senior lecturer, and a very few people might go up to professor. So actually most people's salary probably looked quite like that black line. It went up, and modulo inflation, it stayed. That's the context of final salary, which is not as outrageous as it looks. If, however, you play the red line, and you trundle along, and then you suddenly think, oh, hey, I could have quite a bit of fun being a dean of a faculty, or the vice chancellor, and your salary kicks up. Well, you've got the red path, but what's going to happen to your pension? Now, of course, if you're a very well-known consulting firm who's been paid £750,000 to do calculations about pensions, the black line and the red line are too complicated for you. So you use the blue. You say, you will draw a straight line from entry to exit. I mean, what else are you paying me $750,000 for? So what are the implications for a final salary pension? Because in 2011, we started dropping the final salary for career average for older people and so on. And at the time, there was a fair bit of discussion at Warwick Stats about it, and we were all going, oi. Let's have a look at the next slide. So, apologies to anybody at the back if it's a bit small. And again, we're doing this simply. So I'm imagining you've been there for 40 years, so you're going to get half of your final salary as your pension. What does that mean? Well, if you average over the last 3 years, black gets 32,500, which is what they were on. Blue gets 32,000 because they were just coming up. And red gets 45,000. Whee! If we go back 10 years, well, black of course doesn't change very much because we're in a stable system. Blue goes down a little bit and red goes down quite a lot more. If we do it on career average, then black gets almost 30,000, blue gets 22.5, and red gets 25 and a bit. Now, obviously in a way I would have rather liked to have had a final salary pension, because, you know, I do quite well. But actually, the more I look at it, the more I think in terms of fairness, the career average is probably a fairer system. Either a career average or a fairly long average over the last period of your time. USS actually was incredibly generous. It wasn't merely a last 3 years, it was the highest number they could come out of with the last 3 years. So that, of course, is very dependent on people suddenly shooting up, having not made a large contribution. Your total contribution, if I'm just taking a naive, 25% of your salary has gone in. Okay, hopelessly naive, but it illustrates this. That means the different people have put in 600,000, 461,000, 530,000. So if I now think about what their pension is and how it compares to what they've contributed, well, the black again, that's a fairly long-term staple. They've put in enough money to cover 18.8 years. Okay, so as I said, this is a naive example, but they've paid for about getting on for 20 years of life. The blue has paid for about 14.4, 14 and a half years. And the red, of course, because they're getting such a high pension, has only paid for 12 or 14 years of their pension. Right? So again, that's what sort of makes me think actually career average might actually be a fairer scheme. Okay, but what about our delightful defined contribution that our pension regulator loves and some of our pension ministers have loved? Okay? Oh, sorry, this is just the picture of what's happening. What it also means, by the way, is that if you're a very expensive consulting agency and you assume the blue path, you will be seriously overestimating the liability relative to the amount of money that's gone in. Seriously, right? There's a big difference between 14 and a half and 19. You know, this is not a minor non-material error. Of course, the red, we could be mischievous and talk about certain memorable vice chancellors who had very high salaries. The red are seriously underfunded in terms of liabilities. Of course, tax rules means they'll tend to have locked down. Right, sorry, defined contribution. What happens to defined contribution? Basically, this is the pension regulator's language of de-risking. The pension regulator, as far as I can tell, has one priority. It doesn't have one priority in law. It has one priority in reality, which is to protect the pension protection fund. The pension protection fund exists to pay out promises that have been made. So what's the best way of not having to pay out? Make sure nobody has any promises, and then your fund is safe. Isn't it wonderful? Well, it's wonderful for you. It might not be very wonderful for the Department of Health, the Department of Social Services, a lot of other people, because there are implications, but it's great if all you think about is a protection fund. So basically, if you so-called de-risk by going into defined contribution, what you are saying is, I know exactly what money I'm going to put in as an employer, and it's not my problem. Because you get your lump sum, and you go out and shop for it. So imagine you've got some multiple of 100,000 in your pension pot, and you're going to, first of all, say, I am going to retire at age 65, and nowadays you don't get different for men and women, and that's something I'm going to make our students discuss, the pros and cons. What are the ethical decisions that are being made in that? Age 65, single, my life only, level means no inflation, and no guarantee. So if I take my pension and I die tomorrow, the insurance company keeps all the money. Okay. And if I did that, and I looked at that website, the rate for the 1st of January, I would get £5,000 roughly per year for every 100,000. So somebody, 600,000 is getting about 30,000 a year. If you wanted a little bit of inflation protection, so single with 3% escalation, you can see that drops pretty dramatically. That's 3,400. If you wanted plus 50% joint, if you wanted the kind of thing USS has, which is if you die before your spouse, they get half your pension for the rest of their lives. 4,600. If you want escalating, it's dropped a bit more. That's all the 2020 rates. Now I'm going to go back to single and level, just to show you how much uncertainty you can get. Okay, I've gone back to 2014, so I've gone back 6 years. But if you look at the range within that 6 years, it goes from 4,700 a year, so nearly £400 a month, to over £6,500 a month, right? You really aren't very sure what you're going to get, right? So defined contribution has a huge amount of uncertainty. Oh, by the way, this website says Dundee and Newcastle could be 5% higher. Probably because I think you're more likely to die off early in Newcastle. And I didn't invent the Newcastle, it was there. My father comes from Dundee, so... but you can see, okay, this is quite a lot of uncertainty. Can I just check what's on the next slide? So if we looked at the government rate, which is quoted pension-wise in the government, it's 506, and that would mean these people with their different pension pots would be getting pensions of 23,000, 17.5, 20,000. Definitely a lot less than the defined benefit. And that sort of variation is why in Canada they looked really hard at DBDC and they did the research, and most people would say we would much rather have a bit of risk sharing, perhaps not having a guaranteed inflation increase, than to swap to DC. DC is incredibly expensive. It's a really bad deal for the country, right? Not just for the individuals. Okay, so what else have I said? And by the way, if you want to interrupt me and tell me I'm speaking too fast, or could you just explain that again? Go for it. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. Now, of course, we have a pensions regulator which has a very peculiar view of long term. They've said in their reports that if a pension fund has a strong covenant, they expect them to try to make any estimated deficit good very quickly. Now this is ludicrous. The whole point of a strong covenant is you don't need to panic. And it might be a good idea to keep your company going instead of closing down British Steel or British Home Stores. Of course, that isn't your problem if you're only interested in the pension protection fund. If you're not social services, going to have a large tranche of unemployed people, well, that's their problem, not mine as the pension regulator. Unemployed people tend to have worse health. You also tend to get increases in crime, lots of expenses related to unemployment. But it's not a problem in the pension protection fund. So we're going to try to ask for lots of deficit recovery contributions. Now, what happens if you decided to cap the pension with these salary things? So I've got this three broad parts, and is that going to matter if you're estimating how quickly you're paying back a deficit? Do the parts matter? Yes. The blue is going to underestimate your contribution because above the cap, you're going to have a different amount of money going into your deficit recovery contributions from below. And therefore, if you're assuming the blue line, you're assuming no contributions up till age 55, but the black line is starting to contribute from age 35. So the next slide shows some of the impact of that. If you're saying we've got an estimated deficit, I hate people talking about the deficit. There isn't a deficit. There are estimates. Life is uncertain, right? That's what statisticians do. They talk about, let's try to understand the uncertainty. So the amount of length time of payments has to be estimated, and is that going to depend on your salary class? Well, yes. If you've got a hybrid scheme, it is. Because the salary below, I'm just saying, okay, all the money below goes into the funding, DB. But if you're above a threshold, only 15% is going into your defined contribution pot, and 10% is going into deficit recovery. So as the next slide shows, the contribution, the contribution you are putting in or you're assuming on different salary parts vary from contributing 31,000 5,500, or 10,000. It makes a difference. Okay, this is over the whole lifetime, and you could argue that it's not over the whole lifetime, but those assumptions make a difference. Blue contributes the least, then red, and then black, of course, is the salary path that's contributing the most. Okay, so what have we got next? What's happening to the money that's saved? Okay, obviously you save this money, you want it to be invested. Actually, that's another part of the whole intergenerational fairness discussion. If that money is being invested, so this is what the World Bank is talking about for the Canadian model and how it can be beneficial for developing countries and otherwise. If that money is being invested in building roads and building schools and so on, then it isn't only the pensioners who are benefiting, right? Actually, any large-scale pension fund benefits a potentially very wide range of people. A previous government was going to mandate local government pension funds, which are big, which say you have to invest in infrastructure. Okay. The Quebec pension fund, which is mentioned in the World Bank report, has got a sort of, it does invest, but it isn't forced to arrangement. So we've got all sorts of data, we've got statistical models, and so let's look at one example from the USS that's in the public domain, which is on the next slide. So this was Sheffield, I think, kindly put this up. This was shown to Imperial College Working Group that preceded the Joint Expert Panel. These are the predictions of returns and the uncertainty about them. And the uncertainty is what's being used to be proved. And what they're saying is we're going to take the variation around that and we're going to go down by a third of what we might expect. So we might, on average, 50% of the time, this is 1%, and we've got a distribution, and we reckon that a third of the time it will be 0.5% or lower, -0.5% or lower. Well, what I'd like you to do is look slightly carefully to the right, and this is where a pointer would be useful. Have a look at the central line, and in the first 10 years, the grey line, or the red line, is more than the bar away. Yeah. Whereas there, no, you were right. Put your hand up. Yeah. There, you'll see the difference between blue and red is almost exactly those fine lines. Whereas to the left, the difference between blue and red is larger. Right? How many of you are convinced you can predict years 11 to 20 more reliably than years 1 to 10? How many of you might have said, I think I'd like to see a bit more about this? Okay, next slide, thanks. What do technical actuarial standards say? What's expected of actuaries? Well, Standard 300 for pensions say you must give an indication or description of the volatility of the future funding level and the major causes of the volatility. If you look at the technical provisions consultation document in the public domain, the discount rate proposed for consultation is as follows. Years 1 to 10, CPI minus 0.53%, 11 to 20, CPI plus 2.8%, big jump. De-risking linearly to CPI plus 1.7 by year 21, and then CPI 1.7. So what we've got in this, what is driving our volatility, is a piecewise linear function. Never mind if you're not a mathematician, you don't know what I'm talking about. I'm basically saying the line's going up and down, right? And there's 6 parameters. If you think about it, we've got to choose those 6 values. And we maybe need to think about how they're connected. How would I decide on a jump, 2.5? How did I decide it would take 20 years to de-risk? Are those 2 things connected in any way? Well, you've got to put together, mathematicians please, a set of functions you can defend which map that and achieve less uncertainty for your future estimates. It's an exercise while you're on strike. Okay, next. So what else might we do? Well, we've got to think about life expectancy. And of course, there's quite a lot of data on USS. It's a big fund. There's a lot of data on British Telecom. There's also a fair amount of data on the UK. And the UK Office for National Statistics has been revising their lab tables and finding that life expectancy is not continuing to accelerate. In fact, John Forster was at Southampton now at Warwick, has helped the Office for National Statistics to do their statistics rather better for the extrapolation. So what's happened in USS? What did USS announce? Well, the ONS said, since around 2011, there has been little or no improvement in the mortality rates or life expectancy at all. I think 2011 is 9 years ago. What does the Technical Provisions Consultation Addendum say? 2017. We will assume a long-term improvement rate of 1.8% per annum for males, 1.6% for females, and the long-term improvement rates for males and females are higher than those used in 2014.
Come on, university lecturers aren't representative of the population.
Correct.
We need more detail.
So you can go and look at, you can of course try asking for information, or you can go and look at the Longevity Advisory Project, that's quite the right title, which has looked at this. And actually, when you look at social class, what you find is the highest social class had already got all their improvement in life expectancy, or most of it, because of course they gave up smoking much earlier. They tend to have healthier lifestyles. So yes, they're different, but they actually hit their plateau. But hey, you know, maybe professors are not actually part of the highest social class. I mean, that may just be wrong, perhaps. Okay, next. So, one of the reasons I landed up in all the trouble I'm in was that part of my job, when I started, professor said, well, you need to get a grant with me to look into life expectancy of children with cerebral palsy, which we did. So I now act as an expert witness very often in life expectancy cases. So in 2014, when there was a frequently asked questions by the Employers' Pension Forum, that saw Jacka circulated in other Parliament, and I read the thing that said, question, is part of the liability due to an increase in life expectancy? And the answer said yes. The life expectancy age 65 in 1974, when the fund was set up, was 6 to 8 years. But now in 2014, it's 30 years. I look at life expectancy all the time. I took one look at that and said, that is wrong. Okay? That is completely wrong. And you can look it up in the Office for National Statistics.